Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Today we present the second in our series of interviews with top economists on the state of the economy. How serious is the situation? Could it deteriorate further? And what are the steps the government needs to take? Those are three issues I shall put today to India's former Chief Economic Advisor and former Chairman of Kotak Mahindra Bank, Shankar Acharya. Professor Acharya, let's start with the state of the economy. We all know that economic growth has slumped to 5%, but when you look beyond that, you discover a whole range of sectors that seem to be stagnating. Agricultural growth and manufacturing growth have fallen sharply. Investments are down, sometimes not even happening. Exports have been stagnant for 5 or 6 years, and now in August have even started shrinking, and consumption seems to have collapsed. In fact, it seems the only thing that's growing is unemployment and FPI outflows, and of course, the foreign exchange reserves. What does this tell you about the state of the economy?
Well, you've summarized the situation very well, Karan, and what it tells me is we're in a pretty bad shape. I would be repeating all these things if I went down one by one, so why don't you tell me what you'd like to hear more about?
But tell me, when you say pretty bad shape,
Yeah.
how serious is that?
Well, I don't know if there's a meter on this, but I think what I would most worry about is 2 or 3 things. First, that growth is clearly slowing. And what's more, I think it's going to slow a little further since what we're looking at is 4-month-old data, and assuming that's correct. Second, I think that I would be particularly worried about what it means for things like employment, on which we really won't know for several years how bad the impact is. All that we know on the employment situation, other than the CMI's kind of rotating surveys, wave surveys or whatever they call them, is that according to the National Sample Survey of the Government of India, it was a very bad scene in 2017-18, which is a year and a half ago. In fact, I have not seen data like that as far as employment, unemployment, labor participation rates and so on are concerned. And that was when GDP growth was still much better. So now one hates to think what the underlying employment-unemployment situation is.
Well, in fact, the CMIE monthly figure varies between 7.5 and 8%.
Sure.
Which suggests that unemployment has got worse.
Yes, because it was 6.1 in the NSS survey. But of course, those are not strictly comparable because they're different surveys. But broadly, it's a bad situation and probably trending worse. And that in itself also, I always like to remind people that focusing on the unemployment rate in an economy like ours is perhaps not good enough, because one should also take into account what's happening to the labor force participation rate. That is, what proportion of the working age group population, which is roughly around 900 million people in India, what proportion of that is actually working plus looking for work?
In an article that you wrote for the Business Standard on the 12th, you said it was the lowest on record, the lowest labor force participation rate ever.
That is known to me. Certainly, I've vouched for the last 40 years that it has never been that bad.
So do we have a situation where you could use the word crisis?
There's no definition on crisis. I would certainly say where growth is slowing so dramatically, where underlying employment situation is very poor, where our exports have stagnated, as you pointed out, for 6-7 years, and a number of other things that you alluded to, I think we are getting into a crisis, yes.
I want very much to come to how much worse it could get, and you've written about that in your Business Standard article. But first, let me ask you, as an economist, what's brought our economy to this juncture? What's the cause of the problem that's brought us so low?
Well, in the broader framework, you have to look at also what's happening to the world at large. And really, if one takes a longer view, ever since the so-called global financial crisis, that's been now a decade ago, the world economy as a whole has not been in the kind of boom that it was in the earlier period. It's clearly improved in certain parts. Some countries for some time have done significantly better. But right now, I think we're moving into another slow phase. including in the major economies of the United States, China, Europe, and so forth.
How much of the problem is, if I can use the phrase, self-inflicted? In other words, how much is because of demonetization, which sucked liquidity out, which had an adverse impact on employment in the unorganized sector? And how much is because of the GST, which was perhaps poorly structured and hastily implemented?
I would again take a slightly longer view, if you don't mind, Karan, and say that, really the Indian economy lost its oomph, if you like, in the sense of a period of high growth between roughly 2003 and 2011-12. And if you recall the last 2 years of the UPA government, it was in pretty bad shape for a variety of reasons. Some people talk about scams, some people talk about policy paralysis and so on. But basically, growth had fallen off to 5-6% rate compared to 8+.
So we were sliding down the hill.
We were sliding down the hill. When you had the new NDA government elected with a majority, both as NDA and a single majority of BJP, I think there was, in a sense, sort of animal spirits picked up for a while. And you had a kind of reversal, a temporary reversal, which seemed to be going reasonably well in terms of a recovery, though there are some data issues here.
Is that when demonetization hit?
That's when I think after 2 years of that, you had November 2016, as you know, the impact of demonetization. And the growth numbers of the national accounts people don't show this. Again, I think that's a problem with the numbers rather than what's actually happening in reality. But it was, I think, quite a major shock. One reason why I think it doesn't show up in the numbers, official numbers, not because of any cooking the books, I'm not attributing that. It's simply that our estimates of value added, which is the underlying building block of growth or of national income, in the informal sector is largely secondary. It's not a first-hand readout. It's sort of based on what's happening in the formal sector and a few other things. The details are quite kind of boring.
And when the informal sector is disproportionately affected compared to the formal sector,
exactly,
you have no idea of how badly it's doing.
That's right.
And so your estimation of the informal sector turns out perhaps to be wrong.
Wrong and too optimistic in particular. And I think at that time, some newspapers, including Business Standard, which you mentioned, did some excellent kind of once a week type series of articles looking at what happened in particular clusters, like what happened in Tirupur to garments, what happened in Lucknow to something else, and other places like that. And they showed sort of declines in production and employment in the order of 20-30%.
So demonetization made a situation where the trajectory was downwards, despite the fact there was a bit of a bip upwards. Yeah. It made that downward trajectory worse because it pushed us down the hill even faster.
Right.
To what extent, and this is a bit of an aside, do you agree with Anuprit Subramaniam's research that in fact the new method of calculating GDP is an overestimation, perhaps by as much as 2.5%?
Well, I'm sure you've seen, or maybe you were traveling, I don't know, I've seen my piece on that the previous month, where I think the sum and substance of my views on that would be that I think we have to take what he's written seriously. The particular number of whether it should be 2.5 or a range of 1 to 2, which is what I prefer as a discount, is up for debate.
But there is overestimation.
In the new series, it appears to be, because what he shows, I think quite persuasively, at least to me, is that if you take the period between 2003 and 2011, when the new series hadn't, if you like, come into being officially, and the period after, the earlier period, it's characterized by rapid growth in GDP, as well as things that you associate would normally grow fast with GDP: exports, investment, imports, credit. Later on, all those other things decline sharply in their rate of growth. GDP doesn't.
So when we take solace, if that is the correct term and not an inappropriate one, from the fact we're still growing at 5%, actually we may be growing at 4 and 3.5.
It's possible.
Is this a cyclical or a structural problem?
I get asked this sometimes, and I really don't know what to make of this. One can point to some cyclical things like the global economy, like self-inflicted wounds of demonetization. Initial wound, and then cash becomes normal. You get a kind of solace from that. But I tend to think that we are also sort of an effect of accumulation of inaction on a lot of fronts.
Has made it structural.
Had it made it structural. And that I don't blame just this government, I blame the previous government as well.
So it's a bit more complicated and less straightforward than most people assume. It's a combination of cyclical and structural,
Yes.
which presumably means it actually is a bit more difficult to address than
I
if it
think
were
so.
straightforwardly one or the other.
I think so.
Let's come to an issue you raised in your article in the Business Standard on the 12th.
Yeah.
You said that there were signs, and fairly credible signs, that the 5% growth that we've got to could actually slip in the next 2 quarters, and therefore we could end up below 5%. And you had 3 reasons why you thought this could happen. For the benefit of those who haven't read the Business Standard, what were those 3 reasons?
Pity that the Business Standard has a paywall. No, I think, well, okay, if I can recollect myself. First, I think I pointed to recent trends in the global economy, and that is a recent slackening of growth in the US. Numbers show that. Essentially because the 10-year expansion is running out of steam. China, we all know, is slowing. Again, some people think it's slowing faster than the numbers there show.
Britain, France, Germany.
Britain, France, Germany, which is, and you could throw in Italy certainly at any one time usually. Those are the big ones in Europe, and they're slowing for different sets of reasons perhaps, but
And then there were
and
also
then
domestic.
Japan is not growing fast basically.
And then there were also domestic indicators that you said were distinctly worrying.
Secondly, the second point I think I made is that the GDP number we have is for the first quarter of the fiscal year, ending June. We know that post-June, key areas or key numbers, high-frequency numbers, so to speak, indicators, haven't done well. Corporate earnings reporting on that quarter, but the numbers come out later, weren't good.
Tax revenue.
Export and import data.
Cement, automobile.
Autos have crashed.
Even IIP, although the most recent has gone up marginally.
It sort of, it went down a lot and then came up a bit kind of thing, story.
And the third was, you believe, the response of the government, which was both belated and perhaps not adequate.
I would say that's some very good summary, yeah. I mean, if you look at the budget, which was only 2 months ago after all, you don't get a sense of, we're in serious trouble and we need to do a lot of things.
Now, since you wrote that article, we've been hit by an oil shock.
Right.
Drones have attacked the Saudi oil installations, cutting its output by 50%, and the international oil price has gone up by around 12-15% at the moment. Saudi Arabia supplies something like 17 to 18% of our oil requirement. What impact will this have on India's current account deficit, its fiscal deficit, and finally on its growth?
I would imagine on all those 3 counts, it'll be a negative effect. How much negative remains to be seen, because we have to remember that when you get this kind of a spike because of one particular set of factors, large factors of course, of what's happened in Saudi Arabia, which has taken half of Saudi Arabian oil supply off the market, it's going to have an impact globally. It's going to have a very serious impact, particularly on developing countries which import 80% of their oil needs. That means us. However, there are adjustment possibilities by going to other suppliers, even if the global market is for a while, because other suppliers can also ramp up to some extent. But there are complications, because oil is not a homogeneous thing. There are different distillates. And so,
which would require our refineries having to change the processes, which is also a costly event.
In other words, to what extent can you actually substitute for this Saudi Arabian light that we were importing very easily?
So in addition to the 3 factors you mentioned a moment ago, which suggest that in the next quarter or even in the third quarter hereafter, growth could fall below 5%, there's now a 4th problem. And this problem, the oil situation, could get worse, because we have no idea what's going to actually happen in the West Asian region.
Yeah, but I mean, we shouldn't always think that the sky is going to fall in.
But the possibility of it getting worse can't be ruled out.
Certainly not.
Now, in your Business Standard article, you also looked further down the road. You asked yourself the question, what are the prospects of robust growth returning between 2019-20 and the next 4 or 5 years? And you sort of came to the conclusion that there were 8 good reasons why this may not happen. Can you tell us what are the main reasons which create doubt in your mind?
You have the advantage of the list in front of you. I don't.
But you were the author of the article.
So what? One forgets what one writes. No, I think I won't, not necessarily in the order that I wrote them. The kind of things that have always worried me and continue to worry me even more now. I mean, if I just look at the big picture, what's our biggest resource, allegedly? It's our human resources. 1.3 billion people. China, 1.3 billion people, it's done wonders. Labor force is normally associated with the potential for growth. But then you look at two sets of things associated with that. One, we do such a bad job of education. This is not in my article, so you can't look it up, at least not in this article. Earlier, I had repeated what's known, very well known, that if you look at these annual surveys of education reports that are put out, as you know, by Pratham, which are brilliant, what it shows is people in Standard 5, about half, or perhaps even less than half, can read a Standard 2 text appropriately.
So we are not training our people to be an adequate workforce for an increasingly industrializing economy, and that only compounds further the problem of unemployment, because our problem of unemployment is worsening, and as you pointed out a moment ago, we have the lowest labor participation rate on record.
Yeah, for us, and what's more important, is very poor compared to other developing countries, whether you take China, Indonesia, Bangladesh. They're all, I mean, the participation rates there are in the 60 to 70% or better range.
Ours tend to be below 50.
Yeah, well, not tend to be, has become.
In fact, the other critical points you mentioned were an overvalued exchange rate which has contributed to export stagnation, a public sector dominated by a banking system stressed by NPAs, a decade of high fiscal deficits which has pushed up interest rates and crowded out private investment. Then you also talked about things like high food, fertilizer and irrigation water subsidies which are starving out investment in rural infrastructure. And then you pointed to two particularly important things. You pointed to the colonial legacy of heavy-handed and unresponsive government, as well as the highly stressed and inadequately resourced judicial and police systems. And the last two don't look as if they're going to change at all. I mean, the others might be addressed because governments might be moved to do so, and there's a big if there. But the last two are legacies we've learned to live with. We don't seem to even worry about them. So it's a very bleak situation.
Yeah, I can't, however, relate the last two to what happens to our growth rate in a one-to-one way. No, but I think the reason why I picked out those things, they also impact on the economy. Take the judicial and police things. One is the general law and order situation. And we know some states in India, I won't mention them, where it's seriously affecting economic activity. More generally, even in better run states, if these elements, the judicial system is not working well, for example, commercial contracts become less tight than they ought to be.
And in fact, contract law and the degree to which it's enforced and the efficiency and swiftness with which that happens is critical to business.
Absolutely.
And it's a very slow process in India. In fact, I believe on the ease of business scale, in terms of contract enforcement, we come pretty close to the bottom.
I'm not surprised.
Given this background, are we on track or are we way off mark to achieve Mr. Modi's ambition of becoming a $5 trillion economy by 2024?
Well, that particular target, I think somebody has pointed out, or several people have pointed out, requires at least 8% real growth of the economy. I don't see us getting anywhere near that in the next 5 or 6 years, unless there's a revolution in economic policy in India, which I don't foresee.
So at the moment, we're not heading towards it at all?
I don't think so.
Let's come at this point to the steps the government has taken. Now, to begin with, Nirmala Sitharaman, the finance minister, scrapped the angel tax and the surcharge for FIIs. She took action in terms of people's CSR concerns. She took steps to ameliorate the conditions of the automobile sector. Then a little later, she announced the merger of banks and she front-loaded the 70,000 capital that was to be put into banks. And last weekend, she's taken a series of steps to perhaps make things easier for exporters. When you look at them collectively, does it add up to an impressive response?
Well, let me look at it this way, Karan. you can divide up these series of things that have been done, as I understand it, first into three categories. First category, reversing mistakes in the budget. I think your first 2 or 3 items fall into that. So that's like, oops, I shouldn't have done that, I take it back. Second, 1 or 2 which I'm not sure does good at all, like the consolidation of the public sector banks proposal, or in fact it's a program I believe it's going through. It's not clear to me that that's going to be a good thing. And I'm, after all, only an economist with some experience in the finance ministry. If you had read the article by, I think, Dr. Subbarao a few days ago.
Yesterday.
In the Indian Express, yesterday, where I think he was very harsh on that.
In fact, one of the concerns people have is that if you start merging banks
Right.
that have operated with different traditions, they're going to spend more time sorting out the merger and the
Exactly.
problems it creates, and even less time trying to concentrate on lending. So
Exactly.
you're actually making your problem worse rather than facilitating a solution.
No, absolutely. And I have some experience of this during my years on the board of the Kotak Bank when we did a merger with ING Varsha. It absorbs hugely the span of senior management and senior executives throughout the organization.
So you're distracting them just when you want their attention to focus on lending. What about the
Absolutely.
steps she took last weekend trying to revive exports?
There, I think it's more that the steps that are taken, I think to do with the export subsidy scheme and 1 or 2 other things, in my view, I mean, they're in the right direction, is how I would put them. I personally don't think that they'll have a big impact.
Do they add up to very much, or are they just little bits of tinkering?
I think they add up to little bits of tinkering. For my money, I would focus on 2 other things. One is the correction of the overvaluation, which actually is happening because of circumstance, and that's a good thing.
But not because of the government, because of circumstance.
It's hard to distinguish between the 2 because it's government, otherwise, by direction to the RBI, might have frustrated changes in the exchange rate.
And the second thing?
And the second is, and again something I've been harping on for a couple of years, which is focusing on refunds to exporters of input credit for GST.
She's promised to expedite a variety of refunds that have been held up.
Yeah.
And assuming she lives up to that promise,
That'll help.
but that's a promise government has been making repeatedly for the last 2 years.
That's also
It's
true.
not a new promise, and the problem of holding up funds is a very old problem.
That's
So
true.
she's made this promise, or her predecessors have made this promise. They didn't deliver. One has to hope that when she makes the promise, she will.
Yes,
But there's therefore a question mark there.
I guess.
There is a criticism that is made of the 3 steps that the finance minister has taken, which we just discussed. People say that these are largely addressing the supply side, whereas the problem is on the demand side. And the conclusion is that the finance minister seems to be targeting the wrong target.
I'm not sure I'd go completely with that characterization, Karan, because take the case of change in the exchange rate. What it does is it also shifts demand towards the foreign market away from the home market. So, and you're adding to essentially export demand, if it works, that is.
So there are some things that
Yeah.
actually do
Right.
tackle the demand situation.
Right. However, what I would have liked to see in a little, and this is where the reform pack, if there was a serious reform package which was announced, could have an impact, is on private investment demand, which, as you had pointed out earlier, is flagging. And indeed, compared to,
And that reform package hasn't been announced.
I'm not sure the number of things that have been announced add up to what I would call a serious reform.
Let's then at this point come to what you believe, as a
Yeah.
former chief economic advisor, are the steps the government needs to take. And let me break that question up into 2. Later, I'll come to the more long-term structural reforms that may be necessary. But to begin with the short-term measures, would you say that the most critical short-term measure is to boost demand?
I think one of the critical short-term measures would be not to do too many wrong things further at this point. I think there's a temptation right now to do things which may end up to be counterproductive.
Do you have the budget in mind, where several wrong things were done which had to be corrected?
Budget was one example. Another one where there's an ongoing debate, which is on the cutting GST for automobiles, for example. I'm not sure that's the right thing, because unless there's a massive elasticity of demand for cars and two-wheelers, which I don't believe there is, you'd lose a lot more revenue than the increase in sales that you would get.
To be fair to the government, they're actually resisting fairly stoically the demand to cut GST for automobiles.
So it appears, but I think the meeting is on September 20th.
But the bigger point you're making
Yeah.
is that the government must resist the temptation to do the wrong thing, which means, although you haven't said it so clearly, is that think carefully about what you do, because there could be consequences if you take the wrong action at this point.
Yes. See, because to some extent, you have to accept that whether because of past error on policy or circumstances in the global market or domestically, you may be having to go through a slow period.
What about this question that is raised by many economists, that the demand collapse is the problem and that it is essential to boost demand? Do you believe it is essential to take short-term measures to boost demand?
I think to some extent you have to try and do that.
Such as what would the steps be?
Such as, I think, on monetary policy, they have been reducing the repo rate and so forth, as you know, for the last 7 or 8 months. Further movement along that line, I think, is desirable.
But is it doing anything to demand?
It's doing something, but monetary policy is one of those things which works, in my view, better when you're trying to constrain an inflationary situation than when you're trying to expand in a deflationary situation.
Except that we're trying to expand because inflation is actually quite low down.
Yeah.
So if monetary policy doesn't succeed, what else do they need to do? We're hoping it will succeed, but if it doesn't, what else?
Here, I think, as Subbarao points out in today's piece, I think it's today's piece, that, I agree with him on this one, that fiscal policy simply has no space. I mean, we know that the underlying fiscal deficits, particularly at the center, are higher than shown.
5.8% according to the CAG.
Well, that's, I think, for the previous year, perhaps. And maybe the same for the last year and this one, I don't know. But clearly there's a mismatch in what CAG is saying, other analysts are saying.
So you're
and
saying
what the
at
government's
no
doing.
cost should Nirmala Sitharaman be tempted into allowing her fiscal deficit target to balloon?
No, I didn't say that. I just don't think they should take measures either by cutting taxes or reducing expenditure to shrink the fiscal deficit further. Some of it will happen anyway. This is the so-called automatic stabilizer, that if your economy does worse, you will get less tax revenue and so forth.
So if you don't cut taxes,
Yeah.
then perhaps the only way you can find the money for investment to boost demand would be increased disinvestment.
Again, it's not, people turn to that, and I have nothing against further disinvestment, but think of it this way. Think of the market for loanable funds. If that money is essentially going to be sucked up by government selling equity shares in its enterprises, there'll be less money for the private sector.
Well, then we've ended up with a very interesting situation. You don't think the fiscal deficit should be widened.
Yeah.
You don't think taxes should be cut. You're not sure whether increased disinvestment will actually bring in money because it might suck out money from the private sector anyway. In which case, how does she create demand?
That's why I think fiscal policy, as people have several people have pointed out, including myself, there isn't any space at this point in time. Monetary policy, we're not sure does very much, though it's worth trying because we are in a difficult situation. So I would turn to trade and exchange rate policy to at least do something.
You mean reduce the rupee
Yeah,
further?
well, let it fall. Don't try and shore it up.
Well, this is very interesting. I'm just going to sum up. She has a real problem. An economy that's slowing down and is likely to slow down even further.
Yeah.
But fiscal policy and monetary policy are not going to provide a solution. The only possibility is not to push the rupee down, but not stop it from sliding down. Which means that perhaps the area she should concentrate on as a way of reviving the economy is exports.
Yeah, but the reason I mention exchange rate policy is both from the point of view of exports, as well as you will have import competing industries a better deal.
So you're saying that
rather than resort to customs tariffs, which they have been doing for the last 2 years, and which I think are bad policy in our situation, it's better to let the exchange rate be a little less.
So for now, the easiest engine to fire up is exports.
It's a better bet. Nothing is easy.
What about the fact that some people say that the greatest degree of distress at the moment is in the unorganized sector and in rural India? What does she do about those?
Things like the PM Kisan program, okay? I'm told some money is stuck up in several states, several of the big states.
There were articles in the Indian Express about this yesterday as well as in other papers, that in fact the third tranche has not been paid by more than 35% to people.
Right.
And the government seems to have taken the money but is sitting on it.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on, but that clearly, that bottleneck, that sort of bottleneck should be removed. I mean, once you've announced that program, you should follow through, because it does put spending money in the hands of people who really need the money.
That would perhaps partly take care of rural distress. What about the unorganized sector?
Again, in the unorganized sector, well, I mean, once again, you know, I feel that with better foreign trade policies, and that's something that we don't talk about enough, in fact, significant parts of the unorganized sector, if we had that set of policies right.
MSMEs in particular?
Yeah. Well, medium certainly, and small, I don't know about micro, would do better. Because you have to remember that the exports are about 35 to 40% from the small sector in India.
So we have a very interesting situation. We have a very serious problem, but we have really no obvious and easy solutions. Fiscal and monetary policy are not going to yield very much. She can look to try and expand exports, which will have an impact on the economy, but it's not going to be easy to do. So really, she's a finance minister at the moment in a terrible position. There's a huge and looming problem that could get worse, but there are no easy, available, straightforward solutions.
There aren't any easy answers. And that's where one of the things I suggested earlier was, at the time of the budget, that this is the time you need to fire up animal spirits. I mean, investment, private investment particularly, is responsive not just to interest rates and those sets of factors, but also to, look, you know, we should just invest and get ahead with it.
Well,
but that requires, and firing up, there's no lever called firing up animal spirits, but one set of things that could help a lot is if you're seen to be on track for serious economic reform in areas which are traditionally been very difficult.
Precisely.
Whether these have been labor market, land market, agricultural marketing, you know, a set of these.
Those are precisely the structural reforms I wanted to come to. I deliberately left them to the end. Let's expand on them a bit. What are the sort of land reforms you'd like? And then after that, I'll come to labor and agricultural market.
Well, in fairness, this government did try and reform the amended Land Acquisition
Thrice,
Act.
but failed and gave up. But gave up.
Well, gave up at that time. We don't know. I don't know what the current position on this, whether they gave up because they had a immovable obstacle in the Rajya Sabha, which is what prevented ordinances from going through, or because they lost conviction. I mean, one can argue
or they were scared of Soot Boot Sarkar and that image.
Whatever.
Are you saying now
Yeah.
that immovable obstacle in the Rajya Sabha has ended because they've been pushing through triple talaq and UAAPA bills? Clearly, Mr. Modi, having just won an election, can't be worried about Soot Boot Ki Sarkar any longer. Therefore, are you saying this is a moment when the same sort of land reform can be pushed through?
It's generally true that when you come back with a good, strong mandate in the hustings, that it's in the first year that you really have to push through the difficult political reforms.
He's got 8 months left.
He's got 8 months left. And you know, this, since particularly you're on record of having passed 3 ordinances on this, presumably having thought this through, why not think about it again and try now?
What about labour reform? Again, that was not an issue he tackled at the centre, but he did give permission to BJP governments to take it up. A few did.
Yes.
But what they did was simply push the 100 limit to 300. Do we need wider, deeper, more radical labour reforms? And now that he has a huge majority, is that another bullet he should bite?
I think it definitely is, but it's not a simple thing. Because it's not just one law that has to be changed. It's in a whole gamut of laws. And particularly, it's not very easy to know which set of laws really are holding back, more labor flexibility for greater formal sector hiring. But together they certainly seem to be doing that.
But he's simplified them or codified them into 4 codes. But what's called hire and fire hasn't been addressed.
That is the industrial relations part of the codes hasn't been addressed at all. And that's where I think a lot of the problem is. Indeed, on the part I believe they've tackled, the code on wages, they may in fact have gone slightly the wrong way, because this idea of having centrally determined minimum wages
will take away the advantage of states where actually the wage is poorer.
Yeah.
But on that critical issue of the Industrial Relations Act, what would be your advice to the government?
Do something.
But what?
Well, depends again on which act. It's not one single act.
What about the 100 going to 300 that you can hire and fire?
Why not go back to pre-Mrs. Gandhi?
Which was, for those who don't remember?
You didn't have a number. You had provisions that it's not that you hired and fired without any kind of restriction. You had to have number of weeks of payment, wages paid, and a few other things, bonuses and so forth. And that was in the act.
So a socially responsible way of doing it,
right,
without these cut-offs.
And remembering that the domain of this act in terms of who it actually applies to probably accounts for only somewhere between 10 to 15% of the labor force. And the other 85% is anyway outside these so-called protections.
So you're suggesting...
This doesn't make it easy because our unions are politically strong.
But that is something a strong government must face up to. Good governance doesn't mean to say it's easy.
Yeah.
It means that it tests your caliber and commitment.
Absolutely.
But what you're also suggesting is that one way of tackling the Industrial Relations Act is to simply repeal it, because that will take you back to the pre-Indira Gandhi situation, which you think...
No. The Industrial Disputes Act goes back to 1950s. What Mrs. Gandhi did was strengthen certain provisions.
Repeal what she did.
Yeah.
And that would take you back to a more socially responsible way of hiring and firing.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't be simply firing without any concern for the person.
So there'd be 2 objectives for this. The long-term objective would really be the substance, which is to make formal sector hiring more attractive, so that companies in the formal sector have more employment, and that spreads throughout the system.
And the second?
The second is signaling that you are prepared to take on serious, difficult, politically difficult reform, which might have some positive impact on animal spirits. That's why it would be better if it's done as a part of a package. Land, labor, agricultural marketing, whatever other couple of things you can think of.
On agricultural marketing,
yeah.
What would you like to see?
Well, take the case of the Shankar Acharya committee report, which this government set up very soon after it came into office. Not when I say this government, I mean back in 2014. And I think the report came out in 2015, which really called for wholesale reform of the FCI and the distribution system, subsidies and so on. And basically it was shelved.
You're saying act on it and implement it.
Yeah.
And you believe that if those reforms are implemented, then obstacles like the APMC will disappear.
APMC, you may have to separately do it. And don't forget, much of the how shall I say, the legal framework for that is at the state level. But since the BJP have strong command of many of the state governments, this is a time to act.
Except that when he gave the states permission to implement changes in labor and land, and at that time he controlled 17 or 18 state governments,
right.
Barely 3 or 4 bothered.
Right.
He could have exercised his influence. Frankly, he could have cracked the whip, but he didn't.
Yeah.
And the point you're actually saying is it not that now he needs to take these issues of factor reforms, land, labor, agriculture, much more seriously, assert his authority, and be prepared to send a message that, look, I am taking difficult steps, even if that's at my party's political cost. That would fire up animal spirits.
I think so. But I should not minimize the perceived political obstacles in this.
We've reached a point which I suppose is the end point, that the solution at the end of the day is a display of the Prime Minister's commitment and his determination to bite difficult bullets. Even if I can carry on that silly simile, he cracks a tooth or two.
Your words.
But you haven't disagreed. Professor Acharya, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Karan, as always.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.